Be the envy of the neighborhood. 860 KKAT, where the grass is always greener. Welcome to Gardening Utah. Here's composter and show hoster, Jenna Francis.
Welcome to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jenna Francis. Every episode here on Gardening Utah, we give you inspiration and advice from experts across the state. And we talk about vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, and of course, your lawn. We also talk about plants, bugs, diseases, evergreens, your favorite shrubs, you name it. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope this show is something that you look forward to listening to every single week. We air on the radio in Salt Lake City on weekends at 10 a.m. on 860 AM KKAT. And we also are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. I hope you guys are enjoying this show, binging a little bit of good gardening content while you're out there dreaming of the future garden this coming year. And we're going to keep you guys all in the know of exactly what to do and when. Okay, so today's show is part 2 of last week's episode, where we had so much fun talking with my co-host this week, Cameron Allcott from ProgressivePlants.com, and the all-knowing tree man, Alex Grover. And we have a fun conversation we started talking about pruning all the different fruit trees. And then, of course, we get excited about apple varieties and start talking about all the different amazing apple trees and all the apples that you do want to buy and you don't want to buy. And that was last week. And then this week is a continuation. We start in with a place in Utah, and I'm not going to give it away yet. We start with a place in Utah that they claim has the most amazing apple tree variety, and they explain why, which is pretty fascinating, and then where to get the best fruit pies. So that is coming up in just a minute. But first, the tip of the week.
860 KKAT with your Gardening Utah tip of the week.
My tip of the week is the most important date that a seed starter needs to know is the frost-free date for their individual microclimate. And what do I mean by the frost-free date? That is the day of the year that the last risk of frost is gone. And that day of the year is different all over the state of Utah. It's very different from Farmington to Fillmore to Kanab to Salt Lake City to Ogden and Park City. It is very different. So it is tough to kind of keep you all, as we have listeners in St. George, and for that matter, we have listeners from Idaho and California and Australia. Shout out Australia. But right here, right now, the best thing to do is this. I'm going to be posting a link in our episode notes and on our Facebook page to a link that will give you the exact frost-free date for your microclimate. And that is from USU Extension Service. And your microclimate is probably on here between Alpine all the way to Tree Mountain. So know your frost-free date. And from there, you'll never go wrong because you look at the back of your seed packet and you go back in time, and then you'll know if you can plant a vegetable on your frost-free date, which as an example for Kanab is May 7th. Most often it doesn't freeze past May 7th in Kanab. So for tomatoes, most tomato packets say to start indoors 6 weeks prior to the frost-free date. So we would just go backward in time from May 7th, and that's when you know that you can get those seeds started indoors, okay? Now again, it's different for everyone, and I'll post that link so that you know, but it's still way too early for cucumbers and tomatoes and squash, and I don't want to have anybody's seeds get wasted because they're little seedlings. Once they start sprouting up, they really don't last long indoors and under seed lights. They've really got to be planted at the 4 to 6 weeks stage for most vegetables. Some vegetables like peppers, they can go for 6 to 8 weeks depending on variety. And that's, again, unless everyone has an individual condition. Maybe some of you have greenhouse, and in that case, you're much more advanced in this conversation, so you don't need my help anyway. And some of you may have, cold frames and things, and it's going to vary. And if you're an advanced gardener, you definitely know what you're doing out there. But in general, going backward in time on the seed packet from your frost-free date. Learn what that date is, and you'll never go wrong with starting your seeds. It really does get confusing, though, because all these seed packets show up in all the stores at the same time. But each different kind of vegetable has a very different type of requirement for when they can get started and then when they can get planted outdoors. Now, here's a piece of great news for you. There are a group of seeds in most microclimates in Utah, and think anywhere kind of with a similar microclimate to Salt Lake City, which is where I record this show. We can now, in Salt Lake City, start at the beginning of February, which is basically now, we are able to start broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage are seeds that you can start now because those need to be planted indoors 4 to 6 weeks before outdoor planting. That's kind of for like the Salt Lake City microclimate area. But check your frost-free date and check your seed packets, and you'll never go wrong again. And again, we will keep you in the know here on Gardening Utah, and we'll give you the averages. You know, another average is in about a week and a half, 10 days-ish. We can start onions indoors, which I love. Planting all different kinds of onions. There's such a big difference with store-bought onions than homegrown onions. So know your microclimate's frost-free date. That's your most important date to remember as a seed starter all year.
And that's your Gardening Utah tip of the week, brought to you by the Advocates. If you're in an accident, you deserve an advocate. Call 801-355-5550 or visit UtahAdvocates.com. Never miss a tip for your garden and never miss an episode. The Gardening Utah Podcast with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
Okay, I know I say this all the time, but you guys know what I'm going to be doing this weekend. Aside from skiing, which I absolutely will do, I'll probably watch a little bit of the quote-unquote big game because you can't say the actual word on radio or television. So there you have it. But I'm going to be getting some broccoli and some cauliflower and some cabbage started. I have some fun varieties I've had around for years. So since it's been maybe 3 or 4 years since I've had these packets, because you only plant a few each year, at least in a normal backyard garden, I'm going to plant a few extra just in case I don't have the germination rate that I would like. Okay, so after this, we get into some serious fun with Alex and Cameron. We continue the conversation about apple trees, but we also get into a fascinating discussion about how apple cider is truly made. And we talk about amazing peach tree varieties, and Alex is going to tell us which trees need pollinators and how many you're going to need in your area, depending on whether you live in a new subdivision or an old, more established subdivision. And it's totally fascinating. All right, so I have an announcement. I know I've been hinting to a giveaway that's going to be coming up soon. And now it is almost here. It's going to launch mid next week. Okay, so right now we're in the weekend, the first weekend in February. So early next week, I want you to go to KKAT's website, which I believe is 860amkkat.com. You're going to see a contest, and it's going to be for, drum roll please, it is going to be for a Q&R boxed garden, a raised garden bed worth $400. So I will be reminding you guys on social media as well, but go to KCAT's website and look up how to enter to win. And let's see who can be a winner. All right, we'll be right back after this, right here on Gardening Utah. Stay with us.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden. Here's Jana Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, and with me today is horticulturist Alex Grover and my co-host sidekick today, Cameron Allcott with progressiveplants.com, and we're talking trees.
Down to Fruta, down by Capitol Reef.
No, I haven't made a pilgrimage yet.
Oh,
but when I do, I'll have to wear a special headscarf, letting people know that I've done the pilgrimage like the religion requires.
No, down by Capitol Reef, this little town called Fruta. I mean, it's legendary for like their pies, like the fruit pies that they have down there. But they have like this incredible orchard where they have basically a lot of these old heirloom varieties that weren't really in production for like a very long time. So it's kind of like a cool, thing that there's like, some of these old apples for like when the pioneers were coming over and trying to do things.
They have a few of the original apples that were developed in Utah. Now, this is why it's a pilgrimage. Okay, they've got one, and I don't know the name of it right offhand, but they think there's various variations on it, which could be a natural mutation, or it could be this. It's literally a separate variety. But I want to go down there for this apple. It's not even got a proper name. It's got a number. But it's one of the few apples that's traced back to having been developed or just planted and found in Utah. We have very, very few apples that are, Utah developed, Utah specific. And I think that's a shame because you can pretty well bet, even though grafting was in common use during the period when the pioneers crossed, and of course they brought apples, there were seedling orchards planted. Really right up until, I'm going to give you a lecture on alcohol here, right until beer started taking over. Beer was more of an urban drink than apple cider was, because a farmer with lots of land would plant some apples. Johnny Appleseed planted all his apples from literal seeds. He did not graft. He was religiously against it, literally religiously against it.
Interesting.
And so they would plant the seeds, and if they had the space, it didn't matter whether it was a good eating apple, because most of them aren't. And they would use those for their cider production. And being as they're not like in a situation where they're open, water exposed to disease, the cider was a cleaner drink than the water may be in some areas, especially once Europeans came in and didn't realize that they needed to do their business away from the stream. Europeans weren't very good at that. Wow. And so they would use that when and it was a common drink, various strengths for a lot of things, including fairly young kids, because bad water kills people. And again, the rural areas, that was very common in America and in England. So even with the Mormon pioneers coming across who had a prohibition against drinking, there's quite clear records that there was a bishop down in Provo, and he brewed cider. He fermented cider. That was his job. He was not in trouble for it, because what we know as the word of wisdom really wasn't enforced in the church until into the 19th century. So I've also traced down in Linden, where Los Hermanos is, for anybody in Utah County, that used to be a cidery. And then over here in American Fork, where there's a little strip mall where we've got a 7-Eleven and an ice cream shop. About that location, there used to be American Fork Brewing Company, or not brewing, but bottling company. And they did focus on sodas, but before Prohibition, they also had cider. And so for my area of Utah County, from Provo up to here, those are the things I found. And so this was common enough that I would expect there were a lot of seedling trees, and some of those would have been edible, nice apples. The apples they use for cider are what they call spitters. They're tart, they're bitter, they're still fairly high sugar content, because you can't get alcohol unless you got sugar. But they're something you don't enjoy eating so much as fermenting, and then that changes the nature of things and makes it taste different. So there's your lecture on cider for the day.
Wow. I love it.
I want to go brew myself some cider.
I know. Now I kind of want one.
Well, once this COVID gets over, maybe I'll invite you over for some homebrew.
There you go.
I'm not doing it till I get vaccinated and get my family vaccinated. I don't want to deal with that. But so you had varieties for cider, and they would be again, a different variety. And you could use almost any, and still can use almost any apple for cider. But if you're going to eat them, then it's really, most people find it quite unpleasant to use something that's from seed, except for that one in, I don't know, it depends on who you talk to, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million. Who knows, really? And that's part of the fascination. Apples have this awesome history. Now, there are some awesome histories to do with peaches, too, because in this region, when peaches were brought over by the Spanish originally to southern Utah area, Arizona, into Navajo country, the Navajos loved their peaches. And so they would get the peaches, they'd plant them in their best land, put them near the river so they could get the water they needed, all this stuff. And then when the white man came, you know what land they wanted the most? That prime peaches. Land where the Navajos had their peaches. And then they'd cut the trees down.
Oh, no.
And, you know, yeah. So
we're all shaking.
First of all, you shouldn't be taking somebody else's land. Second of all, if you do take their land, good grief, they're peaches.
Wow.
Have some respect.
Wow.
So, dark times in U.S. history for sure.
Yeah.
So, hey, one other thing that I kind of wanted to maybe touch on a little bit, because here's another thing that I think gets asked a lot, and I think there's a lot of confusion about, is which fruit trees are self-fertile, which means that they can produce their own fruit, versus what types of fruit trees need some sort of pollinator in order for you to get fruit. And how close do they need to be?
Well, you know, it's illegal for cousins to, no, anyway.
Not in Utah.
Yeah.
Actually, it is. But anyway, your peaches are usually self-pollinating. Now, there's a couple of peaches that, of course, decide to break that rule, and I don't remember what they are right offhand.
Okay.
But most of the common varieties are self-fertile. Nectarines are just a peach. And so there's probably some that aren't self-fertile, but again, most of your common ones are self-fertile.
Because like most of your prunus species, because your prunus is going to be your nectarines, your peaches, your cherries, your plums,
your
almonds, apricots. And it's a huge genus.
It's a huge genus, and we have a lot of fruit from it.
Yeah.
Your cherries depends on the cherry, because if you have a sweet cherry, you need a separate sweet cherry variety. If it's a sour cherry, they're self-pollinating.
Oh.
Now, plums are all over the chart because there are a lot of different species of plums. Your European plums are typically, so I said that, typically self-pollinating. Your Asian plums are typically not. Again, you notice how I said typically. Be careful. Apricots are generally self-pollinating. Almonds are all over the place. I've gotten all-in-one for 2 reasons.
To pollinate?
Well, it pollinates itself.
Yep.
It's small, and it does not have a shell nearly as difficult to get into as Hall's Hardy. I mean, you just about have to use a sledgehammer to get in Hall's Hardy. And Hall's Hardy is also more bitter. It's actually a cross with a peach, so it's got a little bit more, it's got a little bit more cyanide. Having said that, you have to eat a lot of those, and it's a very unpleasant process before you get sick.
Yeah.
So, and then did I get all the stone fruits, Cameron, or did I forget one?
It's a huge genus.
It's a huge genus. And there's also various other cherries. I've got a Romeo bush cherry, which is a cross between a sour cherry and I forget the other one. I just saw it the other day too. I just looked at that, and it's a cross. but I like it because it's self-pollinating. It gets maybe 6 feet tall. The cherries are tart, but they still have a high sugar content. And I used to eat pie cherries off the tree when I was a kid, so I'm that guy, and I like the tart fruit, so that's great. But they're self-pollinating, so I can give you general guidelines, but there are multiple species of peach. There's not peach, pardon me, of cherry. There's multiple species of plum, and then there's variation even within the species. So that's difficult. Now, apples, most apples need a pollinator, sort of.
Yeah, because they have they're pretty promiscuous.
Yeah.
Apples are promiscuous?
Yeah.
Apples are funky.
Yeah. Apples, they can be pollinated by other apples, including the crabapple variety. So
I've got a crabapple planted out on my side. It's one that my work was getting rid of because it was the guy I replaced who liked doing flaky things. So I got a Dolgo crabapple, and that crabapple is going to pollinate. It's a great thing. It's not one you're going to sit down and eat because it's too small, but they will pollinate just about any other apple.
I eat them all the time.
I didn't say you don't eat them. I said you're not going to sit down and eat because they're so darn small. You're not going to get a chance to sit down.
Yeah. But it's a bite and you're done.
It's a very tart crab apple. They use them for jams, for jelly. I'm going to try cider with them, although they're probably tart enough. I'll have to make something else with them.
860 KKAT with Jenna Francis and Gardening Utah, where it's always mulch time. She really does have the nicest yard on the block. It's Gardening Utah with Jenna Francis on 860 KKAT.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jenna Francis, and with me today is horticulturist Alex Grover and my co-host sidekick today, Cameron Allcott with ProgressivePlants.com, and we're talking trees.
So I got a Dolgo crabapple, and that crabapple is going to pollinate. It's a great thing. It's not one you're going to sit down and eat because it's too small, but they will pollinate just about any other apple.
I eat them all the time.
I didn't say you don't eat them. I said you're not going to sit down and eat because they're so darn small. You're not going to get a chance to sit down.
Yeah.
But it's a
bite and you're done.
It's a very tart crab apple. They use them for jams, for jelly. I'm going to try cider with them, although they're probably tart enough. I'll have to make something else with them. But they're a great pollinator. I can pollinate. I live on a corner with a cul-de-sac on one side and around the back. That's going to pollinate that whole cul-de-sac around to a couple neighbors on each side and across the street, almost regardless of what variety they have, because it's got such a long bloom time.
Wow.
Now, spacing on any of these trees, by the way, pears are extremely complex. Don't ask. The Bartlett pear is really funky, and I have to do more study on how it pollinates because it's weird. Other pears, not so weird. But most pears, you really should have a cross pollinator, but you won't need one for a Bartlett. It's its own thing. Spacing on it. Classically, they will tell you almost everywhere 100 feet for pollination. When you think about that, depending on the size of neighborhood you're in, that's your neighbor's yard and no further away. I'm in a smaller neighborhood, so it's a little bit different. Now, that's classically what they talk about. Realistically, you can go further than that. I know one extension agent who says 300 feet is reasonable. Not the best pollination, but it'll get the job done. But then again, you look at it and depends on the neighborhood. I've got 2 apple trees currently that are blooming. I've got my Fuji still back there not doing anything. It'll catch up. Fujis are slow. but I've built a higher concentration and I have more apples still going in. And so in my neighborhood, I've got a better chance of that 300 matching up because during apple blossom time, bees are going to be around. I'm plussing it up because I've got a long blooming crabapple. If you're in a neighborhood like they used to, where most people have an apple tree in the backyard, I think both of you are old enough to remember the days when, Utahns planted a lot of gardens and planted fruit trees, and that was part of our culture.
Yes.
If you lived in one of those neighborhoods where those are still there, you don't need to worry about it because somebody's got a fruit tree close by. If you're in one of the new neighborhoods in those fancy places where people have in-home theaters and all that stuff, that's going to get a little bit trickier. But like Cameron said, the most popular crabapple in Utah right now is the spring snow. Correct, Cameron?
Yeah,
that'll pollinate your apples.
Yeah,
they're same species.
Any crabapple will pollinate other apple trees, so you don't need to try to get if you have a red delicious, you don't you don't need to try to get like a golden delicious or yellow transparent or anything like that.
Yeah,
you have as long as you have a crabapple that is on a similar bloom cycle as your fruit tree, your fruiting apple, they will cross pollinate just fine. You'll be able to produce fruit.
Yeah, and that's the thing is we worry about the pollination, but when I'm at a nursery and working there, or sometimes when I'm not working there, because people ask me questions anyway.
Yeah,
that happens. People are like, oh yeah, can you help me with this? Sure. There's certain nurseries that really owe me a commission.
I bet.
Not yours, Cameron. Not yours. Sorry, you're far enough away. I don't make it out there very often. But when I'm doing that, my first thing is, how old is your neighborhood?
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a new neighborhood, you might need to get a second tree to pollinate with apples. But if you are in an existing neighborhood in Utah, chances are that you have an apple close enough. Almost certainly you're going to have a peach close enough. Mm-hmm. Cherries are getting iffier. Of course, cherries is if you can't fight the fruit flies anyway, you're just going to get a high protein snack. Yeah. And pears, again, the most common pear that's planted is still the Bartlett pear. Although I think Anjou that might be doing really well, but the Bartlett is, you can pick it off the tree and eat it, and you don't have to try and get it to ripen fancy or anything. And so the Bartlett's still very common. And again, it's got its own pollination thing. Just don't worry about that one. Your Asian pears will need cross-pollination. Most of your European pears will, except for the Bartlett. Those, because they're not as commonly planted and they're not as promiscuous as apples are, you will need to watch your pollination on your pears, because your Asians and your European usually aren't. And yes, I said usually. There's going to be an exception. Yeah. I just don't know what it is. and that's just how it works. And some pears may actually be pollinated by our ornamental pears, but again, different species, not all compatible. I don't think there's good records on what is compatible, but I kind of, so far most people don't complain about the pears not setting fruit, so they're out there somewhere. Something's happening. And so again, if you're in an old neighborhood, don't stress.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed that most of the clients that I talk to don't really have an issue with producing fruit unless they have some sort of strange off the wall, rare fruit that they didn't know needed a pollinator. Most of your common things don't really seem to be a problem here. Again, like you said, newer neighborhoods might be a little iffy on what kind of harvest that you're going to get. But really, in a lot of the older neighborhoods, I'd say maybe 20 years and older, if they've been around, you're pretty safe on.
I generally, a 10-year-old neighborhood, somebody's going to plant enough fruit trees. And I do my best to help that situation. If I could convince everyone to learn how to prune learn how to thin and plant fruit trees, I would have everyone plant fruit trees. I think it's just the most logical thing. Cameron's making a face. Cameron.
I've done it and I hate it. I'm not gonna lie.
And part of the problem is with pruning fruit trees, and this is somebody that's done it professionally, is I've gone out, I've pruned fruit trees that have been neglected for years. If you start when you plant them and start giving them shape and stuff, it's not that hard.
Yeah, it's the commitment that I have a hard time with the commitment just because of my schedule, because like when you have a nursery, when you need to do all of your work, guess what else you're doing?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons this year I just moved jobs. I work for IHC now.
All right, we'll be right back after this, right here on Gardening Utah. Stay with us.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jenna Francis on 860 KKAT. 860 KKAT with more of the fastest growing show on radio. It's Gardening Utah with Jenna Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jenna Francis, and with me today is horticulturist Alex Grover and my co-host sidekick today, Cameron Allcott with progressiveplants.com.
Cameron, you're going to go on shock. I'm going to have 8-hour days.
Wow.
That's it? 8 hours?
I don't know if I could cope with this, to be honest.
What are you going to do with all this spare time?
Well, I've got a lot of gardening I've got to catch up with, and I miss my bees. I need more bees.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. You keep bees too.
Used to. I honestly have not had the time, and so it's been brutal. And
they're a commitment as well.
Yeah,
I always wanted to get into it, but like I know that I would fail at it just because of the time constraints of what I have to do.
It didn't take that much time though. I don't know. I love having
bees.
Jenna, you're at your house. I'm still at my office.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Bees are marvelous. They're not a high maintenance requirement, but there is certain maintenance that you need to do.
Yes.
And I know Cameron's pain. Been there, done that.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're out running a truck until you cannot see clearly enough to spray, my first job out of college, I would start before the sun came up, and I would go until I could not see anymore. And I would be spending 100 hours a week during planting seasons. Jeez. This was annual flowers. And we started in April, went through May, and then we'd go September and October for fall planting. And I was going to spend 100-hour plus weeks. 100-hour was the conservative estimate. I quit counting after that. And, people talk about wanting to get a degree in horticulture, and that's great. But you really need to think out your career, because not everyone is as crazy as Cameron and I are.
Yeah,
and this year,
wage.
Yeah, I worked it out in that first job out of college. I was salaried, and the labor was making more money than I was.
Yep.
They were literally making more money probably in the whole year than I did. And you have to love what you do to be crazy enough to stay in this field. I graduated with a degree in horticulture, which is odd because Cameron is just as educated as I am. His family's done very well. He's done very well. He skipped the college degree, but I still screwed the system. I got a degree in gardening. He didn't. Nah. And the thing is, most of the people I graduated with are no longer in horticulture. Bunches of them got MBAs and accounting degrees and just bailed out because they could spend
agents.
I have one I graduated with that I think got her doctorate. So far, nobody that graduated in the same period I did or was attending school, to my knowledge, is an extension agent with their bachelor's. But most of them went into other fields because they'd make a lot more money. They might spend a lot of time, but they'd still make a lot more money. And I actually have one friend who's an MD. She works in an emergency room because she wasn't happy and she loved doing stuff, but the first couple companies she worked with were so against the science and doing it right that she just gave up. And all my friends have these lists of difficulties and complaints. It's very common. And so there are a few of us still kicking, but I'm one of the exceptions. And this year I went to a 40-hour-week job. Oh my God. I've done it before. I mean, if you work for an institution or a city or something, you can do it, but the pay is not going to be what other people with college degrees get.
Yeah, it's not the most lucrative career, but for me, it's always been like the most rewarding because I mean, I've always loved to grow things, but I also love to teach, and I love to see people be successful. And to me, that's what I really enjoy about what I do. That's what gets me energized every single day. And like my mom, she's like the CEO of Progressive Plants. She's going to be 67 this year, and she's still putting in more hours than anybody else that I know. And she's working on the production line. She's doing all like the like lifting stuff and putting it down. And I've been just like, I can't even keep up with my own mother at this point.
Yeah, and again,
so much older than me.
I'm a lot like Cameron. That's why I have such an online presence. Is I care about this. I care about having people enjoy it, have good experiences. Mm-hmm. The quality of life that a garden brings is just phenomenal. The peace of mind it brings is phenomenal, which Cameron wouldn't know because he's too busy producing stuff for other people's gardens, right?
Right.
and you do this because you have a passion. You do this because you're a little bit crazy. And I'll tell you, I mean, I'm going to sit back and probably enjoy IHC for a couple of years. I don't know how many years it'll be before I get too bored and do something else that's crazy. And maybe who knows? Maybe I'll actually retire from there. I don't know. I've always been a bit of a rolling stone. At Gypsies, I used to call my mom's side of the family was the gypsy gene. So I tend to move around a lot. But yeah. So anyway, back to pruning because hey, we haven't finished talking about it yet. So we talked about the structure, whether it's going to be open center or whatnot. One thing I'm going to say about this is people like cutting the smaller twigs out of the branches on the lower parts. This is not necessarily a good thing because we want a certain amount of growth there. So we have stuff growing around evenly from top to bottom, and we'll have fewer broken limbs that way. And then when you're pruning, I talked about the percentages. Stone fruits up to 50%, but not necessarily 50%. Apples, pears, generally 25%. You can go a little bit more, but year to year, I really don't want to go over 25% very often. But the first things you take out is dead. Dead don't count on your count because the tree's already accounted for them. You're not going to hurt the tree by taking out a dead limb. There's always that one time when, but for a beginner, don't worry, just take out your dead limbs. Then take out any diseased, any broken limbs. And then you need to try and work on crossing limbs. So I'm going to tell you right now, there's some trees you will have to take out your major crossing limbs because you are never going to get all the crossing limbs out of some of those apples.
Nope.
And by crossing, I mean stuff
apples,
that's actually rubbing.
Yeah, apples are like the worst.
Prairie fire. That is the worst apple for tangles I've ever seen. My dad had one. gorgeous flowers, lovely flowers, lovely lots of things. But those, that's a warped tree. It's just a warped tree.
It's honestly one of probably the most overrated trees that I think are out there. I've never particularly liked it.
I think it's probably one of the older, really nice pink crab apples, and they really are gorgeous. But if you want a healthy tree, you've got to pay for it, and that means a lot of pruning. You've got to hit it every year, and you will never get all the crossing limbs out of it. You can't.
Wow.
You cannot do it. And that's an ornamental crab apple, of course, but apples in general do have a tendency to be very hard to keep all those crossing limbs from, because they're just really good at that. And you just expect that. But you try and take out the worst problems each year, and hopefully you get to the point where you at least don't have a lot.
Yeah.
They will always cross. They will always cross on an apple.
Now, one question I'm wondering is there a certain age of your tree that you need to wait? So let's say you've planted a new, fruit tree last year. How soon do you need to prune it?
Pretty soon.
Really?
I've heard a lot of people say, wait. The thing is, in my career, when I was doing a lot of fruit tree pruning, is people would wait, and then you would spend the next 10 years cleaning up the mess from them waiting.
Okay.
There are reasons that are probably legit. I don't remember them right offhand, but my feeling is plant it, and the next late winter, go ahead and prune. There's always going to be a trade-off on that. But from my perspective, if you don't get that structure when they're young, to make it so that you can access the fruit and so that you don't have a lot of crossing limbs and you don't have all these problems, you'll never catch up. And that's not to say that you're going to prune a whole 25% every year on your apple trees. But if you're not out there at least doing some minor structural tweaks to get it to where you want it to go, you've pretty well lost the game. And again, there are people that disagree with me. I respect that they have a different opinion and a reason for those. But again, from my experience, if you do not get that structure, you've lost. And it's really hard to recover when you've got structural problems or when you let that tree get too big. Most of them don't get too big too fast, but there's always those ones that do. My father-in-law has a property, and to allow his neighbor to develop, they kind of did a property swap. So his neighbor planted all these trees in cow manure by a ditch, and these things shot up quick.
Whoa.
Now, I wasn't there to watch it happening, but I heard, this tree grew so much this year, blah, blah. And, I've been struggling for 14 years to try and get these trees back into shape because they grew fast and were not pruned and not taken care of. And so, I finally got it to the point where I don't have branches hitting the ground, and I sort of got some structure, but it's taken me a long time to get there. And so again, you don't necessarily need to do heavy, but you need to look at the shape of that tree and look where it's going and help the tree to get there so that, in 5 years that can overtake you.
Yeah.
And, I just haven't found a better solution. So I do what makes sense.
Yeah. Gotcha.
That makes sense.
Well, Alex, Cameron, can you believe we're out of time for this episode? I'm in shock. It just seems like every time we talk, we just have such a blast. And then all of a sudden we're out of time. Anyway, thanks so much for being here. And listen, Gardening Utah listeners, make sure that wherever you're listening to this episode, hit that subscribe button so that you can get notified of our next episode. Thank you so much for listening. And next week, we're going to be talking hydroponics. So if you don't know what that is, you're going to learn all about it. And if you do, you're going to learn more. So I'm really looking forward to it, and I can't wait. And remember on Monday or sometime between early next week to check out 860 AM KKAT's website, because we may just have the contest to enter to win the Q&R box raised garden up and going. We for sure will by next week's episode, and I can give you more details, but you just might be able to catch it sometime early next week on KKAT's website. So be sure to enter to win, and we're just so excited about this contest. Shout out to our producer, Lambo. We'll see you next week here on Gardening Utah. I'm Jana Francis. And remember, grow big or go home.
When you're ready to grow big or go home, make your neighbors green with envy. Get the Gardening in Utah podcast, Gardening Utah. Available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden.
We are supported by ProgressivePlants.com. ProgressivePlants.com. They are your neighbors next door and experts at helping you choose the perfect and unique plants that will thrive in your location. Progressive Plants is passionate about helping homeowners, expert gardeners, novices alike choose the correct plant for your soil. They don't just grow plants, they know plants. Let Progressive Plants help you today. Just go to ProgressivePlants.com and check out their wide selection. You can also go to the Design tab and look at the expert designers that they have that can help you plan your perfect yard. Visit ProgressivePlants.com today.